Author Chris Kresser said that they've done controlled feeding studies where they'd feed people 2 to 4 eggs a day, and those showed that in 75% of cases it had zero impact on blood cholesterol levels, and for the other 25% of other people that they've termed hyper-responders, dietary cholesterol does not modestly increase LDL cholesterol, but also increases HDL cholesterol and does not increase the risk of heart disease. This is why the guidelines were changed on dietary cholesterol, as there is no evidence that consuming dietary cholesterol increases the risk of blood cholesterol in most people, and even when it does, there's no evidence that it increases the risk of the heart attack, which is again why the dietary guidelines changed for saturated fat. Again, most of the studies that showed harm were short-term studies. These longer-term studies have shown that on average, saturated fat does not increase saturated fat levels in the blood. In all of the long-term studies they looked at, only one showed any association between saturated fat intake and cholesterol levels in the blood. What do you think of this statement?
Well, there's a whole lot there, and old Chris Kresser just going off with a lot of inaccuracies. So first of all, let's talk about cholesterol and the USDA guidelines. The USDA guidelines, which last came out 2015, 2016, continued to advise reducing saturated fat in the diet. As I said, 21 to 21 major world organizations with different agendas and different scientists agree completely, including the largest cardiac study, the ischemia study, agrees. There's no dispute. Public policy is based on decades of observations, the Finland, North Korea study and others, that you limit saturated fat. And the best way to do that is diminish or exclude animal products. When you get to cholesterol, there's far less cholesterol in the diet than saturated fat from an average American diet. 100 grams of cholesterol is about the size of one toothpick, whereas we might eat a mass of saturated fat in the diet as big as a softball or more. So one egg has 200 to 300 milligrams, so you think about 2 or 3 toothpicks worth of cholesterol. It's not that much of the molecule. It has been studied over and over, and it is true. Some people they're called hyper-absorbers. You change the diet to put more meat in the diet, more chicken, more pork, more egg yolk, you will see quickly a rise in the blood cholesterol, and if the blood cholesterol stays up high enough, there's no doubt if you have enough people, you're raising the risk of heart disease. But another group of people, you can increase the amount of cholesterol in the diet and not see much change in the blood cholesterol level. That's actually not that disputed. We know that. Again, going back to Dr. Ansel Keys, he concluded after decades of science research, the focus of most concern for heart disease is to reduce saturated fat in the diet. The Mediterranean diet, which he observed around Naples, Italy in 1951 and forward, and brought back in 3 books he wrote with his wife Margaret to the United States, very popular books. The Mediterranean diet was largely to avoid high saturated fat diets by substituting olive oil in place of butter, for example. And that is, from a public policy standpoint, an effective move. The guidelines, however, about cholesterol in 2015 did not say it no longer is a nutrient of concern. Their actually exact words were eat as little cholesterol as possible. They used to say 300 milligrams, which is about the cholesterol content of 1 large egg. So they eliminated that exact numerical. You could actually say perhaps it's a more stringent guideline now. Eat as little cholesterol as possible. So 0 is an option. And it's possible to eat only plants that have a 0 cholesterol diet. We synthesize cholesterol. There's no need for the human body to take it in through the diet. Every cell in the body can make cholesterol. So there really isn't a need, and that's an important concept. And then just to circle back, the relationship between eggs and developing heart disease has been complex. It's also in part what's being eaten with the eggs. Is it processed white flour bread? Is it heavily fried in butter or poor quality oils? Is it next to a piece of bacon and sausage, as would be very common? Is it in a sausage muffin with a slice of cheese high in saturated fat. So egg runs with some really bad actors and all. And you're not going to find too many people that eat only eggs without anything else around it, like I just mentioned. Bottom line, there's no data that a diet that contains egg yolks can stop or reverse heart disease, the number one killer of men and women. All diets that have looked at the ability to stop and reverse atherosclerosis have excluded egg yolk in the diet. So it's an unknown experiment that will be difficult to do. You're going to need to get a sizable number of people with heart disease, feed some egg yolk, feed some a diet without egg yolk, and actually measure directly their risk of heart attack or death and measure their atherosclerosis. That hasn't been done. I would always advise my patients, and I would advise the public, given the results of every trial on heart disease that directly showed it is a reversible and serious problem, and the fact that they all excluded egg yolk, and the fact that the USDA says eat as little cholesterol as possible, it would be wise to not eat egg yolk and not take in that source of cholesterol. And then always, how do we produce eggs? It's one of the cruelest, most environmental damaging systems of food supply in the United States in terms of water, soil, air quality. And that's enough of a reason to say I'm not going to put a food on my plate that came out of the tortured life of billions of chickens. It's just abysmal.
Chris Kresser said we have a meta-analysis of observational studies including 350,000 participants that found no relationship between saturated fat intake and cardiovascular disease. The review of 25 randomized controlled trials and 40 observational studies of 650,000 people concluded that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat doesn't lower the risk of cardiovascular disease. What do you think of this statement?
Whether it was directly linked to this meeting of dairy executives in 2008 in Mexico City or not, within a year and a half of that meeting, where the stated purpose in published notes was to identify researchers that were sympathetic to doing research or publications that led the public to believe that foods higher in saturated fat of animal origin, like dairy, were actually good for them. Lo and behold, 2010, a paper was published by the lead author, Patty Siri-Turino. Siri-Turino is her last name, and a few others, ending in a Dr. Ronald Krauss, MD, from Berkeley, California. And it was not original science. It was what's called a meta-analysis, put together a lot of previously published studies, had criteria which studies made it in, which studies didn't, and purported to show they couldn't reproduce in this meta-analysis that diets higher in saturated fat were linked to higher rates of heart disease. That paper really created a stir. Maybe we had it all wrong. Maybe research going back to the 1950s. Maybe Dr. Ansel Keys had it all wrong. Maybe the 7 countries study had it all wrong. Maybe the Adventist Health Group had it all wrong. Maybe the Finland experience called North Karelia studies had it all wrong. Oh, a lot of data. All these metabolic ward studies that showed that saturated fat in controlled setting will raise blood cholesterol. Maybe that was all wrong. I mean, there was really no reason to question all that research, but it did because it was a noisy study and made headlines. What's interesting, the journal that published it allowed a very prominent epidemiologist named Jeremiah Stamler, who just celebrated his 100th birthday recently, so he's cooking along pretty well, to publish a critique of that article in the same journal, which is really rare. Usually an article gets published and a few months later there's letters to the editor pointing out something about the study, criticizing the study. This was in the exact same journal. So you could read the article and you could read a response that basically point by point by point indicated why it was a flawed study. So it had the opportunity to just shut it down right then, but it didn't. It created a group of book writers and online experts and lecturers and other scientists that now had a platform different than the plant-based platform to promote what they either believed in or felt they could profit from, which was a meat-heavy, dairy-heavy, cheese-heavy diet. That was followed up in 2014 by another researcher named Chowdhury, who did a similar analysis, a meta-analysis, not original science, didn't put one human in one metabolic ward and fed them one meal. They just looked at a bunch of papers. That paper also purported to question, using similar studies but a different criteria, that the connection between diets higher in saturated fat was not as closely linked to heart disease as we were led to believe. That also was of such poor quality that many people asked the journal, the Annals of Internal Medicine, to retract the study. They thought it was seriously detrimental to the honesty, the integrity of the scientific literature. It never did get retracted, but it created a stir. And that's really it. I mean, there may be one other study in 2015, but it's not original science. It just has given sort of the pseudo-academic world, the book, The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz in 2014, just enough ammunition to lead the public to be confused. And we know when they're confused and there's a cheeseburger and there's edamame, they're probably going to pick the cheeseburger because they read in Time magazine that the scientists have changed the rules, when indeed nothing changed. We actually know the best diet for the human species is a largely plant-based diet that's largely low in saturated fat and naturally low in cholesterol.